Welcome to our second Saturday conversations. I first want to thank Christy Richter for her willingness to be with us in these sessions. Joe and Christy are partners in this, and they are the ones that know how to do Zoom, and without them, I could not be present for this. So Christy, I'm so appreciative of your willingness and your availability, and I am very new to Zoom, and so we will see how this goes. And I just appreciate your being there and the help that you'll give us today. So anyway, great to have you. So thanks to all of you for being patient with this process, and we are learning as we go. So I appreciate your generosity with all of this. I will be hosting these second Saturday conversations from now until June. I'm going to go for the full academic year. We had our first one last in October. I'll continue this until June. We'll take a break over the summer, and then depending upon the interest, we will reconvene again in the fall. My hope for these conversations is that we will explore Christianity in the 21st century. Okay, the context in which we're reading texts and trying to understand what the stories are about and what God is about and Jesus, and we live in a very different context than in the first century world. So I am hoping that we can open up our conversations in a way that we can, to borrow a phrase, see Christianity again. And this is not to level the institutional claims. It's really to open up some of the claims so that perhaps we can experience anew how this particular tradition, Christianity, speaks to us in these times. As we all know, Christianity is not the only wisdom tradition. There are many, but those of you who are on today obviously have a sense of a kind of allure to continue to explore what Christianity is about. We're not ready to let it go, but we need to see it with new eyes and with a fresh ear. So my hope over this year is that we can explore it in such a way that we are not worried about the dogma police coming and creating anxiety in us about, are we getting it right or are we getting it wrong? It's like, I'd like this to be a more open conversation and just see how Christianity indeed speaks to us. I've given the overall title for this year as Going Home to Another Way. And I borrow that phrase from Matthew's Gospel, which talks about Mary and Jesus and Joseph having to go home by another way in order to avoid the threats of Herod, the king of the time, who found the message of the Jesus message threatening. And this is how the gospel stories tell it, that they needed to go home by another way in order to get home safely. I suggest that not only do we need to continue to go home by another way, as I said, without the threat of the dogma police restricting our conversations, but this will help us to go home to another way. I think that what is at the heart of Christianity is indeed another way of being and living and loving this world that is not maybe what the dominant culture values. Okay. So my hope is that we will not only be exploring going home, which is a very evocative image, by another way, but that we will find that in so doing, we will arrive home to another way, in a way that can engage us and enliven us and speak hope to us, and that we can be participants in that hope for our present and for a future yet to come. Let me also mention that I don't think religions are about providing answers. I think that they are seeking understanding, which is a little different. Seeking understanding and meaning. And I think that that's what the Christian tradition is about too. It's seeking understanding and seeking meaning. To be a little bit cheeky, my hope is that we will find the same Christianity, only entirely different. That was said about the resurrected Jesus, the same Jesus, only entirely different. My conviction is that the heart of Christianity beats strong, that it's well, and that it invites and evokes our heart to be open and to wonder afresh what we are living in and being called to participate in. So let me I'm going to ring the bell and let us just clear our minds for about 30 seconds. And then I'm going to offer some readings as a way to begin our session, which I have kind of provocatively called, I named it last time, saying that today we will be talking about God without sovereignty. So let's just be in the silence for a moment, and then I'll share a couple of readings. I'm going to read you a line from Van Morrison. It's from the song you just heard, When Heart is Open. When heart is open, you will change, just like a flower slowly opening. When heart is open, you will meet your lover, where there's no coming and there's no going. From Jacques Brel, these are lyrics of a song that we'll hear a little bit later. No, love, you're not alone. It's all right if you cry. If things don't turn out right, all we can do is try. No, love, you're not alone. Don't let it get you down. I swear the sun will rise. Here, love, dry your eyes. No, love, you're not alone. No matter what you feel, when shadows cut like knives, somehow we survive. No, love, you're not alone. I swear the earth will stay. White doves will soon fly down. I promise you your day. In lands of storms and snows, we'll plant one burning rose, love. We'll do it if we can. Love, we'll do it if we can. Come on. Come on, love. Come on. And from Gerard Manley Hopkins, a poem called Carrion Comfort. I read this last time as well. Carrion is the dead flesh of a dead animal. So that is his description of despair. Okay. Being deadened through and through. From Hopkins. I'll not carrion comfort, despair. I'll not despair, not feast on thee. Not untwist, slack they may be, these last strands of man in me, or most weary cry, I can no more. I can Can something, hope, wish day come, not choose not to be. Not, I'll not carry in comfort despair, not feast on thee, not untwist, slack they may be, these last strands of man in me, or most weary, cry I can no more. I can something, hope, wish day come, not choose not to be. And from a letter of Paul in the New Testament to those in Corinth. So this is from 1 Corinthians. For God's folly is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength. But God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, things that are not, to reduce to nothing things that are. I'm going to read this again. For God's folly, or God's foolishness, as some translations say, is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength. But God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, things that are not, to reduce to nothing things that are. I want to say a little bit about this notion of God without sovereignty. But let me begin by commenting on the image of God that basically we've inherited. We came into the world with an image of God that God is a strong God, a victorious God. Let me suggest a few descriptions that I think will be very familiar to you, that God is almighty, the everlasting Father, a kind of actually super being, kind of like an Ubermensch, bigger and better than we are as human beings, but kind of akin, a person, a being. That's the image that we receive from classical theism. God is omniscient. God is omnipotent. He basically holds ultimate power. It's the kind of power that can defeat our enemies. To borrow a phrase from Dom Crossan, he'll clean up the mess. Ultimately, God will come in and clean up the mess. And they'll be hell to pay for those who don't abide by his commands and who come under his judgment. And this God, of this victorious, omniscient, omnipotent God, is indeed a judge who basically holds the fate of the world in his hands. Now, and by the way, in Scripture, we are also told that God cares for the oppressed and the homeless and the needy and the hungry. That's also an image of God that runs through our Hebrew Bible and our New Testament. But I think that the sort of classic notion and image of God is of this victorious, sovereign, all-powerful presence and being. I mean, does that sound familiar? And there are a couple of problems with this. One is, if God is really omniscient and observant and all-powerful, why doesn't he intervene more often? I mean, God's track record for intervention isn't all that great. And yet we continue to insist that God will intervene and save the day for us. And what I've seen over my lifetime of being a Christian is that we come up with the darndest excuses for why God isn't doing that. Okay. We sort of make up reasons for why this intervention didn't happen now. And of course, God's ways are not our ways. So this is more than we can begin to understand. And we kind of let it go with that. Okay. Another puzzling aspect about God's sovereignty and a mistake that I think we make is to assume that issues like justice or making structural systemic changes in the world and so forth, we really don't have to fret too much about that, because when all is said and done, God will come in and save the day. That's a very, I think the implications of that are actually kind of dangerous. That's just the kind of intervention that I think empire is hoping for. We don't have to worry that much about justice and systemic change. Our victorious God will come in and save the day at the last. Another image that is associated with this all-powerful sovereign God is that, I mean, this is a loving God, and the hallmark of his love is in sacrificing his only beloved son in a violent execution as the way to bridge the gap between us and God. And that somehow this human sacrifice of his son is what was required to make amends for our shortcomings. This is called substitutionary atonement in the tradition, okay? That Jesus is sort of a substitute for our failings, and yet, you know, and that this had to happen. If God is all that omniscient and wise, it puzzles me why he couldn't have come up with something else. So the notion that he had to sacrifice his only beloved son is a puzzle to me. And the other thing that puzzles me is that if indeed God and even Jesus knew that he would be raised from the dead, that death was done, it was acted out, but that really he was going to be resurrected. That also puzzles me, because that suggests that God knew the outcome, but felt that this was the necessary way to go about it. It's kind of a trick. And that there's an economy suggested here, that if Jesus is executed and is raised again, that somehow that's going to make it all right for the rest of us. That's a kind of transactional way of thinking that I just don't think God operates that way. And as we all know, love is a risk. Love does not always assure an outcome. Love is a risky proposition. And this notion of substitutionary atonement takes the risk out of it, which to my thinking means that love is really not at play. There is something else. There's a different kind of transaction going on. And it is not about love. Now, I know that what I'm suggesting is, you know, kind of rattling, might be rattling you, because these claims of the tradition that God is sovereign, almighty, that God is going to clean up the mess, that God's only beloved son has made the ultimate sacrifice to bridge the gap between us and God. These are interpretations of some of what's at stake in Christianity that I think that are all too familiar to us, and that have been part of our assumed notion of what God and Christianity is about. And that understanding of God, that sovereign God, I think is one that we rightly must question. there's a wonderful, Marcus often talked about meeting with people and they would say, gosh, I don't believe in that God, or I don't believe in God generally. And Marcus would say, well, tell me about the God you don't believe in. And invariably, Marcus would say, I don't believe in that God either. So tell me about the God you don't believe in. That's a great prompting question for people who are sort of culture despisers of religion and God talk these days. It's an interpretation, and there are others. Okay? Let me mention two things that challenge this notion of the sovereignty of God that have really changed the course of theological conversation. One is a theologian philosopher named Feuerbach in 1841. So this is quite a while ago. Feuerbach suggested that our notions of God are human projections. We are projecting on the idea of God what we think is important in the world, what we value, what we think is strength, what we think is optimal, and that God is but a human projection. Now, I don't think that we don't stop there. I don't think Feuerbach, if that's where Feuerbach stopped, fine. I go much farther than that. God is much more than a human projection. And that's one reason that I want us to explore conversations about God is where do we go if God is not just a human projection? Okay. But Feuerbach made this claim that God is a human projection. And that had a decisive effect on philosophers and theologians and how we talk about God. And ultimately, that conversation ended up on the cover of Time magazine, that God is dead. Okay. Well, that God might be dead, but I think the conversation about God is opening up and just beginning in new and exciting ways. So for me, God is not dead. The conversation is not passé. These are things that I want to explore together as we continue this year. But let me mention the second thing that happened that really affected this notion of the sovereignty of God. And that was World War I and World War II. The 20th century was hoped to be the quote unquote Christian century. The magazine, The Christian Century, was a 20th century project, and they called the magazine The Christian Century because the expectation was in this time of progress and everything else that the 20th century, would be the Christian century. Well, we had World War I and World War II, and we've had other tragedies in addition. But those two events also gave theologians and philosophers pause, particularly theologians pause, about what do we mean when we say that God is sovereign, almighty. He's got a plan for us. We may not know what it is. As I said, God's ways are not our ways, but that the whole world is in his hands. All of that came under a kind of collapse and a reevaluation in the last centuries. So the notion of a sovereign God has come under question, and rightly so. So let me now shift to what would a God without sovereignty, what are the kinds of things we might consider as we continue to explore what are we talking about when we talk about God? What is God up to? Okay. And let me acknowledge who is influencing and challenging my thinking on this. There are two people who have influenced me greatly around the Christian tradition, biblical and theological study. One is Marcus Borg, and I will borrow from him shamelessly. The other one, and this is more recent for me, is John Caputo. And he is a philosopher theologian. He is considered a quote unquote radical theologian. But John Caputo has a lot of very interesting thoughts about a non-sovereign God. And I am exploring this and wondering about this. So I want to express some of his perspectives as grist for the mill as we continue to explore how this might be shaping our understanding, our imagination, our sense of possibilities for how we talk about God and Christianity in the 21st century. Let me share with you a sentence that I heard him say recently about theology. And theology, in brief, is the study of God, okay, theology. Caputo suggests that theology, the study of God, is about the vulnerability of the human body. Theology is about the vulnerability of the body. I never would have defined theology that way. Okay. What is expressed here is that to be human is to live with uncertainty. To be human is in part to be fragile. To be human has its limits. We're mortal. Okay. We're not Ubermensch. We're mortal. We're fragile. And also the human being is a remarkable, we're a remarkable part of existence. So he suggests that the study of theology, that theology is about the vulnerability of the body. So if that's what it is to study God, how does that play with our thoughts about God being sovereign or almighty? Where does God really meet us? Caputo suggests that God meets us in that very vulnerability, that God meets us in the places of our own limit, that like love, and the Christian tradition will say that God is love. Okay, I think that's right. That love risks. Love risks. Love will risk justice, compassion, kindness. Love will risk itself for those things. Love risks for goodness in us and for goodness in the world. Love will risk that, will risk itself. And if I'm understanding Caputo at all, I think that he is suggesting that God risks in us, with us, for the good. Now, a premise in all of this, and this is a biblical premise, that ultimately we are good, that creation is good, that our covenant with life, our contract with life, is that we favor the good, and that we see that this is intrinsic to its deep structure. And that there is even something in our deep structure as human beings that is good. Okay. Now, granted, there is sin and evil in the world, and things do not always go as we'd like. We as human beings are capable of heinous things. So we know that there's evil. We know that there is sin, if you will. You know, some people describe sin as a paralysis. Some describe evil as ruined time. You know, those are also operative in the world. I suggest that's the price of admission. That's a given in the world. But what is also a given, according to the biblical vision, and I think what Caputo was wanting us to affirm as well, is that deep in the structure of things is goodness. And that God is what summons that goodness. God evokes and calls forth and summons that goodness in us. And we can deny it and ignore it and refuse it and walk away from it. We can walk away from that summons. We can walk away from that call. The call of God does not coerce. The call to goodness does not coerce. We do not have, it doesn't call upon an army to get us to comply. But it insists that there is a goodness in us and that God calls that, summons that out of us, and that even if we ignore it, hopefully we're haunted by it. Caputo suggests that God, without the kind of sovereignty that I described a minute ago, that sort of more triumphant, militaristic, coercive kind of sovereignty, that is not what God is about. That God is about a call, a summons that evokes in us a goodness that is deep in the structure of our very being. I am amused by, I don't know that much about physics, but there is the neutrino, which is the little superhero subatomic particle of the subatomic particle world, the neutrino. And what I understand about the neutrino, and by the way, there are billions of those in our own body, and it was there at the Big Bang, the neutrino. The neutrino prefers matter to antimatter. Now, in terms of physics, I don't really know how to parse that, okay? But I love the language that the neutrino has a preference for matter rather than antimatter. So I would like to use that as sort of a suggestion that there's something deep in us that is more partial to matter than to antimatter. And Caputo suggests that goodness in us, that call to creativity, that call to possibility, that call to a more open future that we are called to participate in, that is the dynamic of God with us. That God, we are summoned to respond to that kind of call. So we are responsible for what we do. And that what we do in the name of compassion and kindness and love, when we risk our lives for things like that, those things are worthy of the name of God. Those things are worthy of the name of God. And that power to risk, the power to risk, is what Jack Caputo suggests is the, quote, weakness of God, as opposed to a strong theology, which is based on that sovereignty of God. He suggests that whatever God is, that it is more of a summons and a call and an invitation of love that wants to risk the goodness for ourselves and for others, the goodness in ourselves and the goodness that is in the world and in others. So I'm curious to know what you make of that. Caputo's suggestion of a, quote, weak theology, and by the way, that term, weak theology, has been around for a long, long time. It hasn't gotten a lot of traction. It's not very sexy. I don't think that we think that sounds very good. God is a God of weak theology. But with his premise that theology is really about the vulnerability of the body, and that God works within that, that's a given in our world. it shifts things around from God being sovereign, almighty, he's going to clean up the mess, to God being a call, a summons that evokes a response in us, and that our response is what we do in the world in the name of God, for the goodness of the world, for the goodness of life, for the affirmation of life, that those things are worthy of the name of God. Now, that's an interpretation. So we have an interpretation of what God means in terms of sovereignty and strength. We have an interpretation that suggests that maybe God doesn't really work that way, that God is more of a call and a lure than a coercion. Those are interpretations, okay? And next month, I'll talk a little bit more about interpretation. The fancy word for that is hermeneutics. Human beings interpret. That's what we do. We interpret all the time. We tell stories and we interpret, okay? So, and some interpretations are better than others, granted, okay? So I wanted to put these two thoughts out, the strong theology, the weak theology, the sovereign God, the God without sovereignty, as ways to just sort of open up our thinking about God in the 21st century, because that also is really going to affect what we think Christianity is about in the 21st century as well. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to play a song from Jacques Brel. It's No Love, You're Not Alone. And it's about 5 minutes, so this will give us just a little change of pace and change of sense. The song is about a woman who's talking to her lover. You know, no love, you're not alone. You know, I'll hold you for a while. We'll do what we can. Okay. I also suggest that maybe this is love itself talking to us and calling us love. No love, you're not alone. This is love speaking to us. Just a thought. So Christy, why don't you go ahead and cue that up and just sit back, relax, enjoy listening to this Jacques Brel song, No Love, You're Not Alone. And by the way, I think that's weak theology. You're not alone. But what accompanies us is a little different than what we might at first imagine. Let me tell you what I'd like to do now. And this is the dreaded small groups. So let me say a little bit before you click off. Last time we did some small groups. We'll hopefully put you in groups of 5 randomly. And if for some reason, Christy, if some reason this doesn't work, then we'll just go to plenary. We won't do small groups. But well, in fact, you know what? I think we'll just do plenary. Okay. So we won't do small groups right now. But what I am going to do is suggest a couple of things for you to think about. Okay. And by the way, the reason I wanted to do small groups is because there are people from all across the country that are here. There are people from Oregon, there are people from Texas, there are people from Maine, So what I want you all to know is that there are people all over who are curious about this kind of stuff and talking about this. Okay. So just like the song says, no love, you're not alone. There are a whole bunch of us that are wanting to understand Christianity in a new key, understand it in a new light, if you will, have it continue to speak love and light and power to us and help us in the living of our days. We need it. We need an encouragement. We need a sense of hope. We need a sense of possibility, a sense of possibility. So I just want you to know that there are people who are engaged in this conversation and are wanting to open up the conversation and see what we discover. That's one of the reasons for putting it in small groups, is to realize, oh, here's somebody from Indiana. Oh, here's somebody. But in light of our delays today, we'll be in a plenary group instead. So what I'm going to do is suggest a couple things for us to think about. Then I'm going to read you some guidelines for listening and for speaking. And I get this from the Learning Hearts Ministries. You can find it online. We have a copy of it on our website, the Marcus J. Borg Foundation website. I'll read you the discerning listening guidelines. Then I'll repeat the questions again. Then I'll give us just a minute in silence to see what comes up. And then I'll invite you to share some thoughts, responses, whatever. Okay. So let me prompt you a little bit. And I'll repeat these after I've read the guidelines. What do you make of this notion of God being a summons or a call? Something that evokes a goodness in us, a sense of hope, a sense of possibility. What do you think of that? Could that be something about God that's not God as a being, but it's something that we do in the name of God? Something is evoked from us that wills and longs for our good and for a future. Okay? So what do you think of that idea that God might be more of a summons or a call, not coercive, but more that than a quote unquote being? And by the way, the notion of God as a being, the God of supernatural theism, that in the discussions today, that is a dead image. But God is anything but dead. So first about summons. The second thing I will ask you to see if maybe you want to respond to this. What do you make of that notion of quote unquote weak theology? That God is not the kind of sovereign, I've got the whole world in my hands. I'm going to clean up the mess. I'm going to take care of this. And if not in this lifetime, you'll see the reward in the next. So not to worry. If things don't go that well here on, this time, not to worry, because I have a reward for you, but it's in the next life. What do you make of the thought that, no, that's not how God acts? That there is a weakness which is more akin to how love risks for life. Okay? That kind of weakness. What do you make of that idea of a quote weak theology? And perhaps there's something else that in light of this discussion pops up for you, that it's like whatever I've been talking about, that an image or a thought pops up for you, that you're starting to think about something that maybe you didn't before, and maybe that's something you want to share. Okay. So I will repeat those in just a moment, but let me share with you the listening guidelines that I think are really, really helpful for listening and for speaking. And as we do this as a group, I encourage you to keep these guidelines in mind. Okay, it's a kind of courtesy. These are guidelines of hospitality. So there are 10 of them. Let me read them to you. Take time to become settled in God's presence. Okay, I'm going to give us a minute in the silence before we start in the group. Listen to others with your entire self. Senses, feelings, intuition, imagination, rational faculties. Do not interrupt. Yeah, Christy, that's okay. I'm just going to read these. We'll post this on the website. Do not interrupt. Pause between speakers to absorb what has been said. Do not formulate what you want to say while someone else is speaking. Speak for yourself only. Okay? Express your own thoughts and feelings, referring to your own experiences. Avoid being hypothetical. Steer away from broad generalizations. Do not challenge what others say. Listen to the group as a whole, to those who have not spoken aloud, as well as to those who have. Generally leave space for anyone who may want to speak a first time before speaking a second time. And hold your desires and opinions, even your convictions, lightly. So, as we will take a minute of silence after I ring the bell, and then after that minute, I'll ring the bell again, and then invite some comments from you. What do you make of this notion of God being a summons or a call? That God evokes the goodness in us. Basically, God is about goodness. God evokes goodness in us. What do you think of the notion of weak theology? Does that resonate at all for you? Okay. Or is it a disappointment? Or is there a thought or something that has come up in your own mind in the course of this conversation this morning that you want to name and you want to share? Okay. So I am going to ring the bell, give us a minute in silence, see just what comes up. Be mindful that as we share as a group, that there are a number of us on this call today. So make sure that you can be as precise and clear as possible. That's not my strength, but I'm encouraging you to be as clear as you can be, to just offer a thought, a reflection about summons or call, weak theology, or a thought that's come up for you today. Okay, so I'm going to ring the bell. I'll ring it again at the end of 1 minute, and then I'll invite your participation. Okay. Who would like to share something, offer something, a reflection, a comment, impression?
I would. Marianne? I would. Yeah.
Oh, yes, yes. Christy, will you, do you want to pull her up on?
Ormseth?
Hello, Bev Ormseth. I can't see you yet. Hopefully Christy can spot you and find you, but Bev, why don't you go ahead and because I can hear you. That would...
Well, what I have, I'm speaking for myself, but it is a wonderful quote, and I have to give the person credit. It's from John Meacham.
Oh, indeed.
And I was just so struck, I was reminded of it this morning. This is the quote. I believe in God based on the same evidence that I believe in love. Both are invisible forces with visible effects.
Great. Just say it again, Bev. I love that. Just repeat that again.
I believe in God based on the same evidence that I believe in love. Both are invisible forces with visible effects.
I love it.
I do too.
I love it. And I wonder in some ways if that's what Corinthians is getting at when it says, you know, God shows things in the world, things that are not, to reduce to nothing things that are not invisible. It's like love is invisible, but we see the effects of it, perhaps more transformationally and more powerfully than what the might of this world might think it can accomplish. So I think I would like to think that Paul is hinting at the same thing. Anyway, thank you for that. That's a great quote from John Meacham. I love it. And that says in, a moment what I think I've been struggling to articulate for the last 30. So thank you, Bev. Great. Appreciate it.
Could I say something, Marianne? Can you hear me? Yeah. I'm actually in Dublin. I don't know how I got onto this group.
Oh, my dear. Oh, my dear. Okay.
And I remember welcoming Marcus and Dom here. Oh, it must be 2 decades ago now, when they were going to the Skelligs. So it was amazing to see that picture on your screen.
That's Marcus, descending Skellig Michael.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes,
absolutely.
yes.
So anyhow, that's by the by. But just to say, being in Ireland, I'm of course very much aware of the Celtic creation feelings, and I have been very aware and very connected recently with the feeling of God as creator and the creative force within all our lives, and that if we can only connect with this each day and each hour, not only the love in creation, but the wonder in creation, and that this is what we're called to. And I think that this connects also with the current, I might almost say, enthusiasm for contemplative prayer and meditation and centering prayer. It's all part of the same thing. Mm-hmm. So yes, I relate to your God as summons and call. Could I add as invitation as well?
Absolutely.
Thank
Absolutely.
you.
As invitation. Yeah. I think that our scripture texts, by the way, our sacred texts are more invitation than statements that need defending. I mean, I think that our sacred texts are invitations. I see our place in the world as this is all an invitation. It's an invitation. And I love what you're saying too about the wonder, the awe and wonder, because I think that even in the midst of our despair and complexities and all the things we don't know, that the very fact that we are alive is remarkable.
Miraculous.
It's remarkable. And yes, we're vulnerable, and our flesh is wounded. But when we think about just the fact of our existence, it is remarkable. And I think that that's also kind of what prayer is about, is to get us in a place where we take notice of that.
I edit a journal called Search. It's the Church of Ireland Theological Journal, and I have a remarkable article that was contributed by a woman struggling with the pandemic issues. And why is God doing nothing about it? Maybe I'm asking the wrong question. And she came through to the same rejection you're making of the sovereign God and the outside God who's supposed to be organizing things. And she brought in Taoism from the one side and medieval Irish theology from the other, which all links up with process theology, the idea of working through creation and inviting us to work through creation with him. I'll send you a copy of it.
Oh, lovely, lovely. And I love what you're doing is that, we're opening up the conversation about God. And I think that's a good thing.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I would like to make a comment.
Yes.
Okay. When you mentioned summoning by God, the first thing that popped into my mind was trying to resist it. I mean, the classic story of resisting a summons by God or invitation by God is the book of Noah. He went to all these extremes, tried to avoid going to Nineveh, and in the end, he succumbed. Okay. And then another comment about, you mentioned awe. I think that when we live in big cities and we have light pollution, you are sort of devoid of this awe and wonder we used to have by looking up into the sky and seeing the universe. Growing up in North Dakota, I mean, that was fantastic. And I had a chance to relive that, about 10 years ago when I went to my 50th high school reunion. And we took a side trip through the national parks out in Wyoming, Yellowstone. And I went out 11 o'clock at night in Red Lodge, Montana, and I looked up, and I now know why they call it Big Sky Country. You are filled with this immense feeling of awe and gratitude in order to be a participant in this great creation. And when we have light pollution, we are robbed of that feeling. You have to get out of your city and your town. You have to go out where it's dark to really feel this great, immense feeling of belonging to something that is so much bigger than yourself. And you realize it's about beloving and not believing.
Nice. Yeah, thank you, Kyle. Yeah, thank you so much. I love that.
Could I make
Next.
This is Claudia. Could I make a comment?
Of course. Love it.
As you were talking about God being a calling, a summons, I thought about Jesus, because in my faith tradition, we talk about Jesus calling us to live the life God intends. And since Jesus is Christ and Christ is God, it is God calling us, but it's not a foreign concept. It's just that for thousands of years, we personified God as a being, but Jesus never said that.
Yeah, right. And I think that when we mix up Jesus' divinity and God, I think that makes us think that somehow God is a being also, So the notion of God as a being has been around for a long, long time. We long for that, that belonging sense. We're relational. We long for that kind of relational intimacy. I think we can have intimacy with God, even though God is not a being. God is more maybe being, but that's a whole philosophical thing that's been volleyed about for decades. So, but anyway, yes, as a call. And in a sense, I think a lot of what Jesus called us to was to pay attention to this presence in us and in the deep structure of the world, and love it and give your life for it.
Marianne?
May I offer a comment?
Sure.
I was perfectly happy to ditch both omnipotent and omniscience. But there's an omni which I like, which is omnipresent,
Okay.
which I think is a helpful thought. And I wanted to say that it seemed to me that the concept of call is also helpful when thinking about the evolutionary process. I mean, whatever is going on, so to speak, has been going on for billions of years before we turned up. Now one can see the evolutionary process as being one which is actually being called into being by God. May I just add that was a contribution from London, England.
Lovely, lovely. Yes.
Can I?
Thank you. And that omnipresence, just so long as we don't confuse presence with person.
Exactly.
Yes, but and because we are part of something. There's something going on.
Exactly.
And you know what? We all know it.
Yeah, exactly.
We know it. We wonder about it. We may not be able to completely narrate it. We can't really fully name it, but on some level, we know it.
Yeah.
And as Augustine says, it creates a kind of restlessness in us. And so be it. So be it. Thank you so much. And blessing. Good.
I have a comment. Marianne.
Yes.
So I'm kind of, I wouldn't mention this except I
Hi,
suppose.
David. I'm happy to see you.
You too. I suppose I wouldn't mention this except I thought it would come up. That is, I can't think of a greater representation or epitome of the suffering or vulnerable body than Jesus on the cross. And the answer to the sacrificial atonement theology or whatever it's called might actually be that image, right? That to be human, fully human, is to endure that.
Right.
And on the cross, he actually recites the Psalms of despair.
Mhm.
And I think that there's a great profundity in that. The cost of giving up the omnipotent God is, of course, that the feeling of security that you seek is gone, and you have to find a deeper sense of security, and that's the hard part, as far as I can see.
Yes. That's
You wouldn't want to have a God who didn't share the suffering that you're suffering.
right. Oh, I think that's really well said. And uncertainty is part of being a human being. You know, we do live with uncertainty. And I love what you're suggesting about Jesus on the cross. You know, what I love about how the artists depict the resurrected Jesus, he still has his wounds. He still has his wounds. So there's something about that too, that I think speaks to what Caputo might be hinting at when he talks about weak theology. We still have our wounds.
Yeah.
You know, and yet. Okay. Thank you, David. It's nice to see you. I've missed you, David.
Marianne,
Abandoned as a friend.
Dawn here.
Yes.
When you look at Caputo's talking about the weakness of God, would that also involve then the concept that God does not act upon us or without us, but that God acts with us and through us, so that the weakness of God gets reflected in the weakness or strength of us as responders to Jesus, whom we think gives us the way?
I think that's wonderfully put.
Mhm.
We respond, and we are responsible. But
And that's exciting.
Pardon?
That's exciting.
Thank you. I agree with you. That's exciting. It puts our relationship with the call, it puts our relationship to one another and to the world in a very different place than our thinking that we have to have this checklist of belief, if you will, and that what we're really interested in is getting to heaven. I just think that is it completely short circuits and almost blasphemes the privilege of life here and now. You know. So anyway, I love what you said and how you said it. Yeah, and I agree with you. It's in us, through us, and we respond to this. This is where Feuerbach, where he says, you know, God is a human projection. Fair enough. To a great extent, God is a human projection. But I think that what's really at hand is that we are responding. That, as was said earlier, is beyond us. And we know it.
Marianne,
Yes.
your neutrino comment got me
Oh, yes.
excited. I did, yeah. I just was reading some things, the theoretical physicist Carlo Rovelli,
Oh, yes.
and he has a small book out on time. And he talks about, and it relates to where the neutrinos prefer matter to antimatter. And he says the concept of time is that matter meets and responds. So, and when I read that, I'm going, what? But as you say this, and it's the call and your comment that it's deep within inside us in that in order to create the sense of time and things happening and the responses, that it is, you know, it's time. It's the neutrino. It's that, and what it that encounter and unfolding in those encounters. So that just sparked it. Almost made sense to me.
Well, I'm working with it too. It almost makes,
I know. He's going, what?
yeah, but I love that you affirm that, yes, the neutrino, prefers matter to antimatter,
Right. And it's called to meet, to create time and history and content.
I love it. It's called to meet, to create. The create and enlighten what you and enlighten what you okay, very good. Thank you so much. I think there was someone else.
Miriam, this is Evelyn, and I'm in Lake Oswego, Oregon. And I loved being introduced to that notion about theology as being about the vulnerability of the body. And when I heard that, I felt a sense of coming home, because the body is the one thing that we can touch and feel, and it keeps us rooted in the present. And when I heard that, it was an invitation, or I felt that God invites us to live deeper into the wisdom of our own knowing, and invites us to deepen our own vulnerability, which we may resist at times because that can be painful. And so we may abdicate to another notion or understanding or desire for God. And then I also thought about how the notion of God shapes every aspect of our life. And when you talked about weak leadership, I don't want to dwell on this, but I also thought about, weak theology. It just led me to think briefly of weak leadership, the kind of sovereign politics that says, I'm going to clean up the mess. Mm-hmm. So that's all I want to say.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And I love what you're saying about maybe part of the invitation, if theology is about the vulnerability of the body, okay, that it's an invitation to experience more of our vulnerability. As you were saying, we may not at first like that idea, but it'll be interesting to explore, what does that mean to be more vulnerable, so anyway, thank you for that. And also it made you feel at home. It's like, okay, going home to another way. And to feel that to be at home is also to be at home with our own vulnerability. That is home of a different sort. Maybe we might initially imagine.
Marianne, I was thinking that kind of vulnerability that you're talking about reminded me of a poem that I discovered the other day by an African poet by the name of Tapiwa Mugabe.
Yes, please.
The line from the poem is, I am strong in my softness. I am strong in my softness. You could add vulnerability there. And it made me recall a conversation I had with a young father who was talking to his daughter, and he said she's 6 years old and she's acting like a teenager, which he didn't expect until she turned at least 13. She was being very oppositional to him, and he realized that his fallback as a father was to mirror his own father, who was an evangelical pastor and raised him in a very strict way, very much in the sovereign God sort of vein. And so he had been clashing with his daughter all day and just butting heads. And of course, she could up the ante to no end. And finally, he just sort of broke down and he picked her up and held her. And she put her head on his chest. And he said, the love that flowed between us was so strong that I knew that everything was okay. And to me, it's that force that we're talking about. That is what is calling us forward to our best selves. And just that picture of a father who lets go of that old image of the sovereign, I'm in charge, and picks up his child and feels in his body that love flowing To me, that's what you're talking about. And that puts shoe leather to it.
Thank you, Jeff. And Jeff, read that phrase again from the poet.
Yeah, it's, he says, a place where I am strong in my softness.
Interesting. Jeff, thank you for that. We're getting close to the end of our time. That's actually a lovely place for us to, you'll have the last word, Jeff. Thank you. I really value that. Let me say, I've got 2 announcements, and then I'll close today with 2 very brief readings, okay? And we will continue this conversation next time, all right? So those of you who didn't have an opportunity to share, we'll have more time for this. And maybe we'll do more plenary and not small groups. I know small groups is, some people just absolutely hate them. I tend not to like them myself, but let me know. Put a note in a chat room or something about what your feelings are about doing small groups, and maybe we can sometimes do them and sometimes not. But two things I want to announce. One is that next time on the 14th of November, our next session, I'm going to share the platform with a friend and a theologian, Lutheran pastor. He's also been a member of the Jesus Seminar, which is also called the West Star Institute, Jarmo Tarki. He lives in Southern California. And next time, I'm going to continue to talk about hermeneutics, which is the fancy word for interpretation. And Jarmo and I talked about exploring what Stephen Colbert calls truthiness. So I think we're going to talk some about interpretation and truthiness next time, because that's also something that we tangle with, I think. So I will have a guest with me next time. And I want to give a few minutes to a friend, Brant Pope, who is also new Marcus. He knows Marcus's work very well. And Brant is, in his generosity and in his skill and in his love for all this stuff, is going to be offering some podcasts for us that we will put on our website. And I think as early as this week. Brant, do you want to say a little something about why you're doing this and what your topics are going to be?
Well, perhaps like many of you, I fell in love with the work of Marcus Borg. And after I bought his first book, I quickly bought every single thing that he wrote. And he became my intellectual and spiritual passion. And I've done a number of workshops and seminars on his work in Texas and in Pennsylvania and in New York. And so what Marianne and I talked about is what I just recorded this morning. Actually, I'm in the Eastern time zone, so this morning wasn't so early. Podcasts that can either be a refresher for those of you who know Marcus's work, or perhaps an introduction to those who may not know it as well. But a 20 to 30 minute concise summary of Marcus's work on the Bible, God, Jesus, our Christian language, and then something down the road about how his work might have implications for the way we practice our communally as Christians. So these will be on the website probably as early as next week. And it's amazing how the work you're doing on Second Saturdays dovetails so beautifully with the podcast. So I invite you to listen to those, and we'll see you next time on November 14th.
Okay. Oh, Brant, thank you so much. And I consider Brant a partner in this love affair we have with Marcus Borg and Christianity. So I'm so grateful, Brant, that you are giving us these nice summaries and speaking Marcus Borg again, and helping us to get re-excited about the work that he has left for us. Okay. So thank you. I appreciate it. Okay. I am going to close our session today with two brief readings, and I will read them twice. This is from T.S. Eliot. These are only hints and guesses, hints followed by guesses, and the rest is prayer, observance, discipline, thought, and action. The hint half guessed, the hint half guessed, the gift half understood is incarnation. I'll read it again. These are only hints and guesses. I think that's a good description of our conversations. These are only hints and guesses. Hints followed by guesses. And the rest is prayer, observance, discipline, thought, and action. The hint half guessed, the gift half understood is incarnation. That's us. And from R.S. Thomas. I have seen the sun break through to illuminate a small field for a while, and gone my way and forgotten it. But that was the pearl of great price, the one field that had the treasure in it. I realize now that I must give all that I have to possess it. I wonder if the call doesn't come to us in some ways like that bright field. We can walk away from it. But my hope is that it haunts us to where we will want to return to it and give our life to it. I have seen the sun break through to illuminate a small field for a while, and gone my way and forgotten it. But that was the pearl of great price, the one field that had the treasure in it. I realize now that I must give all that I have to possess it. In this next month, to borrow from Jacques Brel, may we plant one burning rose, whatever that may be for you. Plant one burning rose and vote. Vote. And again, I say, vote. Be safe, stay well, take care, and know that life is short, and we do not have much time to gladden the hearts of those who travel the way with us. So be swift to love and make haste to be kind. Thank you for being with us today, and I hope you join us again on November 14th.
Thank you, Marianne.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This was wonderful.
You're welcome.